Hello, my name is Jenny Hull. I am a senior here at UVM and I'm pursuing a minor in sociology. Today I'll be talking about genocide in general, the motivations behind it, as well as a more specific incident concerning the Holocaust, Hitler's Germany, and the Soviet Union, concerning the Great Terror, and especially the land that these regimes overlap. The following is based off two articles, Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, and Making Sense of the Senseless, Understanding Genocide by Daniel Churett and Jennifer Edwards. Churett and Edwards argue that genocide is spurred by four different motivations. Convenience is the first one that they go into, and you can see it throughout history. Sometimes it's just more convenient to remove your enemy population. If you have an obstacle, a challenge, it's just rational. In this case, it serves as a motivation for genocide, just convenience of the genocide. And it could be an alternative goal you have. Some countries attack civilian populations, kill mass amount of people to get a surrender. It's convenient to enact a genocide, is one of the motivations that Churett and Edward argue here. Revenge is the second motivation that they analyze. They say genocidal acts, as big as they are and as devastating and terrible, they're rarely based on cold calculations. So pure convenience is not often the motivation, they argue. The third motivation they go into is fear, whether it's rational or irrational. Fear is often the motivator of genocide, fear of the opposite population, fear of the impact, part of this victimization mentality. Purification is the final motivation that they analyze, which is pretty self-explanatory, especially with the well-known example of the Holocaust that we are all pretty familiar with. Of course, real-life events are rarely so simplified that you can identify one clear motivation, especially for something as complicated as these topics. Therefore, it's usually overlapping motivations or combined that cause these events. The second article is very, very different. It is called Bloodlands, and it takes a much closer look at the mass killing done by Stalin and Hitler in the same region. They have two totally different ideologies, but they result in the same genocide is what the argument is if you're looking at it through the definition that Churett and Edwards offer, a mass killing of people. So today's world, the Bloodlands refers to the area between then Soviet Union, now Russia. It includes St. Petersburg, the western rim of the Russian Federation, most of Poland, the Baltic states, Belarus, and the Ukraine. It's where the two powers really overlapped, where much of the damage that we study in the Holocaust was done. So to connect these two readings to each other, there's some really obvious connections here. One studies genocide, and the other really focuses a lot on the Holocaust. So there's much to be related here. But I'd like to specify it into the motivations that Snyder goes into and how we can take Churett and Edwards' view with the four classified motivations and how we can apply that to Snyder's description of what happened in the Bloodlands. So the first thing that I came across was the presence of fear. Churett and Edwards identified fear as a motivator, and I think that corresponds with Snyder's assessment of Hitler's plan to colonize the Soviet Union to economically advance the country. I think a lot of the motivation Snyder was arguing was economically related. He was saying that the mere ideology you can connect back to economic purposes. And in the state that Germany was at the end of World War I, they had a lot to fear when it comes to economic. Their inflation was crazy after World War I. They were economically very, very poor. They owed countries millions and millions of dollars, which caused the inflation. There was room to be feared for their own role on the world stage. Purification is an obvious motivator for part of Hitler's plan. If you look at one of his main goals called the final solution, which he actually was very determined on. It was one of his plans that did not change. In fact, he implemented it faster than he originally had planned to. This was to annihilate the Jewish race and to elevate the Aryan race and keep it pure and supreme. So that was a clear example of purification. Stalin, however, didn't murder for purification. He murdered to protect socialism, which was his means of economically advancing the country. He wanted to industrialize the Soviet Union, and his policies of killing, I think, were a combination of fear and convenience, more so than Hitler's. His practices of generally straight death for the Jews and the populations he was targeting, rarely did he use work camps. When he needed coats for the army, he would use a work camp and then kill the Jews, have them work first to help his cause. But Stalin put his enemies in his own country, which is another difference between the two. He did a lot of murdering and enacted genocide in his own country. He put them into work camps, which is very convenient for him. He would put the well-off peasants into work camps, and others who he would intentionally starve to death, he was able to sell the surplus of food out of the country, which is also very convenient. He was getting rid of his perceived enemy population, saving money by not feeding them, in fact earning money from exporting food as citizens of his country starved to death. And then the other people that he deemed would go into labor camps, gulags, work to death, providing production, part of the production in the country of goods. Another very convenient thing for Stalin. But fear was also a big element in Stalin's motivations. He was very genuinely afraid that these well-off peasants would start an uprising and resist the socialist movement to the point where they would threaten his socialist movement, which is part of his motivation for enacting all these mass-killing policies. These successful farmers wouldn't want to go into collective farming. They wouldn't want to give up their land and their wealth. And through him deporting them to these work camps, he got all their land, just as the Germans got the plunder of the Jews that were killed, which was very convenient. I think fear is more important when trying to understand the lower level perpetrators of genocide. It wasn't really put too much into this context by Chirrut and Edwards, but it really relates to how we often try to put ourselves in the victim's shoes and feel empathy for them and think of the perpetrators as monsters, but the sheer amount of people that were involved in this, it's something to think about how this could happen, and I think fear plays an important role in that. Besides the elite who created the policies and sent the orders, the soldiers and police carried out these mass killings, and bystanders watched it happen, and nothing was... there's some cases of people helping people escape and everything, but on a general large scale, this all happened. It's real history. So why did it happen? How could it happen? I think fear, not of their higher ups, but fear of the population that they were killing played a real role for these soldiers and policemen. And Snyder gives a great example of two soldiers, a German soldier that believed the death grimace of the Pole proved that Poles were irrationally hated Germans. And that's the motivation, that it's a you against us mentality, which allowed him to do his job. And then there was another communist under Stalin's soldier who felt under attack by the starved at his doorstep. So they both portrayed themselves as victims, and that it was a me versus you thing. They didn't want to do this, but better you than me, and they felt threatened, which is part of the fear motivation that Chirrut and Edwards go into. I didn't find many parts to be very problematic, but I would have appreciated more of analysis in more complicated situations instead of clear examples for clear motivations by Chirrut and Edwards. And I also want to point out that their definition was very interesting and not like the definitions that we commonly see for genocide, which usually have a point about the motivation of the perpetrator, which qualifies it as a genocide versus a mass murder scenario. So if they had used one of those definitions, they would have a less strong article because their whole article was about the different motivations one could have. While some definitions say, no, this is the only motivation you can have for genocide because that's what makes it a genocide. So I thought that was interesting. I really enjoyed the Bloodlands article and the examination of both regimes in their ideology and then the commonalities that they had, including the results of the genocide, as well as the differences in how they were motivated. I thought that was really interesting, and the victimization aspect of how that's a common trend for these populations, the perpetrators, to have that mentality, portraying themselves as the victim. I thought that was interesting, and it actually reminded me of the white supremacist interviews and how they spoke of their ideology.